This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and today is Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited Magic. As usual, in the first Nitsa Notes after my set review is complete, I'm going to do a video here on the best commons and uncommons in the new set. That new set being Murders at Karlov Manor. It's sort of a Cliff's Notes version of my set review where I talk about the really good commons and uncommons in each color. It's a useful video to watch if you want a refresher from the set review or if you want the information sort of condensed. Because this information, if you don't have the time to watch a whole set review, is, I guess, the next best thing where you can really think about the commons and uncommons, which are obviously really important in Limited. So let's go ahead and dive right in, starting with white. So I think the third best white common is Inside Source. This is 2 generic and a white, and you get a 1/1 and a 2/2 detective token. That kind of card's often going to be, like if the card stops here, that card's often going to be one of the better commons in white. But it doesn't stop there, because it also has the ability to buff a detective and give it vigilance. The ability's a little bit expensive, but it's basically gravy, and it's not a terrible ability when you're at the point in the game where, you don't have anything else to do with your mana. It's got a pretty good shot at making a detective into a legit attacker if you have one around. In addition to working well in the detective deck, it also is a card that works well in the red-white deck, which is an aggro deck that wants to go wide. So it's a really nice common, one that I think is right on the barrier between first pickable and not first pickable, but it's really good nonetheless. I think the second best white common is Novice Inspector. So, 1 mana for a 1/2, Investigate. This is a card we've seen before in Thraben Inspector. It was a really good common last time. It's going to be a really good common this time. You just, first of all, you get 2 things for 1 mana. We've seen time and time again in Limited that kind of card is just good because of the amount of mana you spend. And this also happens to be good for, it's a detective, so it's good in the blue-white deck, and it makes a clue, so it's good in all the clue decks, which is a lot of them. And even if you're not getting any synergy at all out of this, it's still an amazing card because it adds 2 things to the board for 1 single mana. And I think there's a chance it ends up being white's best common, but for now, I think white's best common is Makeshift Binding, a Oblivion Ring-like effect. Only hits creatures, but it hits them, exiles them until it leaves the battlefield, and it gains you life. I don't think it should be overstated how much better that makes a card like this, because sometimes you're in a spot where you're like, okay, I can remove something, but I'm still dead. Well, the chances of that still being true go way, way down when you're also gaining life. Subtracting from your opponent's board, gaining life at the same time is one of the best ways to get ahead of an aggro deck, or one of the best ways to win a race, and that makes Makeshift Binding really good. It can get destroyed. There are some cards that I think are going to be main deck cards, like the 5 mana 5/5 that has Disguise, and when you turn it face up, it naturalizes. You're going to have to worry about that some. But it's still an amazing, amazing card. Like I said, I wouldn't be completely shocked if Novice Inspector ends up being number 1. 1 and 2 are almost certainly going to be the Inspector and Makeshift Binding, though, and both of them are easily first pickable cards. And then I think white's best uncommon is Case of the Getaway Express. I mean, it's hard for this not to be amazing. This is because, if you had an enchantment that only had the base effect this card has, it'd be like a C or a C+, an okay removal spell, but one that takes some work to actually do its thing. We've seen this kind of effect for 1 mana work out reasonably well, usually at instant speed, to be fair. So this costs twice as much, and it is situational removal. Sure. But it's frequently going to be able to kill something, and then it's not that hard, especially if you've just killed something and you're in white, to solve this, the turn you play it in many cases. And then once you do that, it's making your board even better because it gives +1/+0 to everything. So, it's a removal spell with upside, and it's always hard for that not to be a great card. Let's move to blue now, where I think the third best common is Deduce. This doesn't add to the board, but I just feel like 1 generic and a blue, draw a card, investigate. It's sort of like Thraben Inspector, or Novice Inspector, excuse me. In that it gives you 2 things. It does cost twice the mana, and it doesn't add a body to the board. Obviously, it's nowhere near as good as the Inspector, but it just seems like it's going to give you enough in a format where this stuff really matters, getting a clue really matters, for it to be a pretty good common. It does hurt a little bit that there's not a dedicated spell deck in the format. I think this would be more firmly entrenched, in that area of being, a really good blue common if it was. As is, it's certainly not one you want to first pick, but I think it's pretty good. After that, we've got Crime Stopper Sprite. So this is a Windrake, a 3-mana 2/2 flyer. If you collect evidence, when it enters, it stuns something. But even if you don't have evidence to collect, which you're not usually going to on turn 3, sometimes you can set it up, but frequently you won't. But even if you're not, there's a pretty good chance it comes down, taps their one blocker, and then you attack, And that's fine, especially on an evasive creature. And then in the late game, the stun effect is pretty legit. So it's a common that I like a fair bit. I think Blue's best common, though, is Cold Case Cracker. So it's another flyer with a stat line that used to be really good, sort of like Crime Stopper Sprite, 4-mana 3/3 flyer. That stat line's not as good as it used to be, but this is a card that has a useful creature type as a detective, and it makes a clue, and it's still an okay stat line. So I think all of those things taken into account mean that Cold Case Cracker is Blue's best common. I will say I don't think any of these are like things you feel great about first picking. They're all pretty good, but none of them are on the same level as Novice Inspector or Makeshift Binding. And I think Blue's best uncommon, it's one that's a little bit of a build around, but it just seems like such an engine that it's hard for me not to want to take it early, and that's Surveillance Monitor. It's a 4-mana 3/3. When it enters, you can collect evidence, and anytime you collect evidence, you get a 1/1 Thopter. So that means when it enters the battlefield, it will make a Thopter a decent chunk of the time. Collect evidence 4 is certainly doable by turn 4. It's not automatic, but, if you're playing a card like this, you probably have a little bit of setup for it, like the 2-mana 1/3 that mills 3. Like, that's pretty likely to let you do this. And Surveillance Monitor, I just see it frequently being 4 mana for a 3/3 and a 1/1 flyer. That's a very good limited card already. The 1/1 flyer happens to be an artifact in a format where that matters, if you're in red, blue-red, that is. And in addition to that, it's likely to crank out like 2 or 3 more other Thopters if it's left unchecked. And that kind of value is pretty hard to overcome. All right, let's move to black now. I think black's third best common is Extract Confession. So this card, I think, has a really cool design. Like, I think it's one of the best ways to utilize a graveyard mechanic like this, one that needs setup, because the base of this card is a card that's, like, fine on turn 2 or 3, right? It's an Edict. But by the later game, it's really not impossible for you to collect evidence with it. And when you do that, it becomes a much better Edict in most ways, because it makes your opponent sacrifice their highest power creature. And, that's not always going to be their best creature, but it's going to be their best creature, like, 80% of the time. And for 2 mana, that's going to feel really, really good. And collecting evidence, the great thing about this is this effect is good even in the late game when you finally can collect evidence, and this card is pretty good on turn 2, turn 3. It does have kind of a middle ground where it's kind of mediocre. Your opponent has like 4 creatures and one of them's a token or something. But early and late, it's going to feel good, and I think that's enough for it to be a pretty good card. I think black's second best common is another removal spell, Slice from the Shadows. X and a black, instant, -X to something. And it can't be countered, which matters in a format with Disguise, so don't forget that. Normally that text doesn't matter, but they put the reminder text. By the way, Ward doesn't affect this, so people would realize that. And that definitely matters. This will never feel super efficient, but it will also never feel bad. And it does have times where it allows a blowout because it's an instant and you can hit something when they're using a trick or whatever. So far we're at 2 removal spells for black, but I think black's best common is also a removal spell, and it's Murder. So we're at 3 of them here. Murder is a card we've seen before. Last time we saw Murder, it underachieved a little. It wasn't bad, but I think it ended up being more like a C+ level card than a B, like I'm thinking it will be in this format. The double black matters. That hurts a little bit. Extract Confession and Slice from the Shadows are easier to cast. But, it's still instant, destroy target creature. I'm going to go into basically any format, assuming Murder is going to be really good. And there's a chance it isn't, but, I think it most likely is, and it's certainly not going to be bad. But yeah. And then I think black's best uncommon, also a removal spell. Black usually has a bunch of removal spells on this kind of list. I thought about maybe including something that's not, but I just couldn't really find myself thinking any commons, for example, were better than these three right now. There's like the 2-mana 1/1, your opponent exiles a card from their hand. It's pretty good, but I think these three are better. But the uncommon is also a removal spell, but at least it also does something else, and that's Soul Enervation, an enchantment with flash that gives -4/-4 to something. And then it has a payoff for when you collect evidence. When you exile a creature from your graveyard, you get to drain life. So, this card would be great without the drain life part, and that just makes it, it probably wouldn't be on this list without it. That does just enough to make it the best black uncommon, I think. But even without it, it would be a card you'd first pick, and it certainly is with that extra bit of value it gives you. All right, let's move now to red, where I think the third best common is Shock. So, like Murder, this is a card we see all the time, and it's pretty good. 1 red mana, 2 damage to any target. It lets you, there are 4 drops in every format that this can kill, like no questions asked. And that kind of tempo is absurd. Then it can also, it's very hard not to come out ahead. Even killing a 2-drop is giving you a tempo advantage when you shock it. The one thing about it in this format that might weaken it slightly is there are going to be a bunch of 2/2s with Ward 2, which will make shock a lot worse. But it's still so cheap that, like, paying 3 to shock their face-down creature before it ever gets a chance to turn face up is still fine. It's not going to feel great, but it's fine. And it can also hit your opponent, of course. Person of Interest, I think, is the second best red common. 4 mana for 2 2/2s is a nice rate. One of them has Suspect. So, in some ways it's better than just 2 4-mana 2/2s. In some ways it's worse, because that means the creature can't block and it has Menace. But I think overall that's good. I mean, adding 2 bodies to the board, one of them has Menace, is just like a huge upgrade to how much damage you can deal, because your opponent now has to, throw 3 bodies in front of them to stop them from hurting them at all. And if you have tricks and stuff to back that up, it's a big deal. There's a detective involved. The Suspect mechanic is something black-red's into. So we've got a lot of synergy propping this card up. The red-white deck is about going wide. So you've got a good rate, and then you've got lots of archetype-specific stuff that makes Person of Interest really good here. And then red's best common is Galvanize. 1 generic and a red. Every time we see a 2-mana deal 3 at instant speed, it's red's best common, more or less. I can't really think of a time. I guess Dominaria United, Lightning Strike was surprisingly medium, but that was a weird format. Most of the time, this is where we have the 2-mana deal 3. And this one can do 5 sometimes. You have to draw an extra card somewhere, like Crack a Clue or whatever, to do it, but that's not a huge ask in the format either. And I think red's best uncommon is Case of the Burning Masks. It's a lot like Case of the Gateway Express, except even better. Like, this might be a bomb-level uncommon. I gave it a B+ in the set review. But if someone told me they wanted to say it's an A-, I wouldn't fight them on it, really. Because this comes down, does 3, right? So 3-mana deal 3 isn't, quite as good as Galvanize, right? But we've got some real big upside here, and I think it's fairly accessible upside. So if you do damage, period, with 3 sources in a turn, you get to solve this. And so what that means is, first it counts itself. So, the turn you play it anyway, it'll count itself. And then if you just have 2 other creatures in play who attack, unless your opponent kills one of them before they do damage or whatever, most of the time that's going to be enough to transform it. And that can happen in the early game. That can happen even easier in the later stages of the game, because it only checks damage being dealt. It doesn't have to be to a player or anything like that. Then it gets solved. And I do want to talk about this card, go a little deep here on how cases work, because there were some people who were confused in the set review who saw this, and cases get solved at your instep, and a lot of people thought that meant you had to sacrifice Case of the Burning Masks in the comments for the set review, like you had to do it then, and that meant you could only cast an instant, which, that card would be kind of okay still if you have some instants in your deck. It's some upside, but you don't have to sack it then. You can just wait till main phase. That way you can sack it, cast whatever you want among those top 3, and not have to worry about it being an instant. So, in other words, this is a removal spell that's a 2-for-1, that has a very accessible 2-for-1 status. The removal it grants you isn't situational at all either, like Case of the Getaway Express. So, it gives you a bunch of value up front, and then later in the game, or sometimes on your next turn, it's going to give you another card, and that's powerful. And it's picking 1 out of 3 is so much better. It would still be good if you just exiled the top and then you could play it, but the top 3 is just so much better than just looking at one card by like a wide margin. So anyway, it's great. It might be the best uncommon in the set. You know, the only bad thing to say about it is it costs double red, and if that's where you're going, then it's a really good card. So let's move now to green. I think the third best green common is Bite Down on Crime. So another removal spell, another one that gets better with Collect Evidence. And it's another one, it doesn't scale quite as much as the Edict with Collect Evidence, but, you know, paying 4 for this to give something +2/+0 and do damage equal to its power to an opposing creature, that is already a card that you'd basically never cut like the first 2 copies of from your green deck. Sure, you have to be a little bit careful about when you cast it because it's a fight spell and all that. But like stats boost plus kill a creature, those kinds of fight cards, and this one's not even a fight because your creature doesn't get damage, it's a punch card. Those kinds of cards are always really good because they often remove something and make a creature way better at attacking too. So it's already a really good card. You throw in Collect Evidence, and it allows you to pay less mana, which obviously makes it even better. So, you know, it is a really good removal spell. And I think if green didn't have 2 other, like, really good commons, like in a lot of formats it would be green's best common, but there are 2 other commons that I think mean pretty serious business in this format. And I think all 3 of these, by the way, all these green commons are very first pickable. So, yeah. Tunnel Tipster, I think, is the second best green common. 2 mana 1/1 that can tap for green is fine. You know, it's a solid card. But this has some pretty real upside that gets around one of the downsides of these mana dorks. And that is that, like, you know, there comes a point in the game where your 2 mana 1/1's best thing it's going to do is chump block, basically. And Tunnel Tipster likes it when you play disguise things, so it's going to get like a counter or 2. And, you know, suddenly by the mid to late game, it's a 3/3, which not only is relevant as a blocker that can trade, but might even be able to attack your opponent. So, you know, it just looks really good to me. And then I think green's best common is Rubble Belt Maverick. My first instinct when I see a card like this would not be to say it's green's best common, but we've seen so many times of late 1 mana cards that just do a bunch of little stuff be the best common in a color, that's got to be what this is gonna. That's got to be what's gonna happen here. You know, 1 mana 1/1 Surveil 2, already great in this format. Like I would, if it stopped there, this would be a nice little enabler for Collect Evidence decks, and even outside of Collect Evidence decks, it allows you to get some nice card selection. But if you're in green, you're gonna have cards that Collect Evidence. That's like one of the big mechanical things going on in green in this set. So it sets that up for you. I mean, this is a card that can actually allow you to set up Collect Evidence 6 on like turn 2. And I think that's going to be, when you can do that, when you can play like the 2 mana 1/3 reach that puts a counter and gain 2 life on something, if you can make that happen on turn 2 consistently and after playing a turn 1 Maverick, like that's pretty good. And those are 2 commons, right? And so it can set up early Collect Evidence stuff and make your cards, even in the early game, way better. But it doesn't stop there because it, after it dies, can give something a counter. You know, it's not a huge effect by any stretch, but it is one. You know, it reminds me a little bit of the 1 mana 1/1 lifelink from Brothers War, you know, that could, from the graveyard, incubate. Maybe that was March of the Machine, but you know what I mean. Either way, that card, you know, was a nice little 1-drop, and then it did stuff from the graveyard. That's what this is too. And it looks to me like it's going to be a really good common, just because it's powerful, like inherently, for how much it gives you for the cost, and because it has a bunch of synergy. And I think green's best uncommon is Green Belt Radical. So, you know, this is a disguise creature that you can play face down. And it's also a 4 mana 4/4. Like, that stat line is still pretty legit in Limited. You know, it's not one we see that much at Common, for example. We see it at Uncommon and higher a fair bit, but we still don't really see that at Common very often. And so that's this card's baseline, like a C-level card. But then it has this insane disguise ability. So in the late game, you can turn it face up, and it overruns your whole board. So, you know, put a counter on all your stuff and give it trample. If you're playing against a green deck and they have a disguise creature and like 3 other creatures in play, and they attack with everything and they have 7 mana up, you know it's probably going to happen. So there are going to be a lot of games ended by Greenbelt Radical late, and then there's going to be a lot of games where it just comes down as a 4/4 and rumbles just fine, makes your opponent spend a removal spell on it or gets in for 4 before they can kill it, So it's just got this really good baseline and then this late game overrun effect that's just going to end a ton of games. So those are my picks for the best commons and uncommons for Limited in Murders at Karlov Manor. This coming week, there'll finally be some draft videos up on the format. They didn't have an early access event this time around. So normally I would have had draft videos up already when this video goes up. Not this time. The first one should come out on Tuesday next week. And then next week, in Needs and Notes, we'll be taking an early look, giving you some early takeaways about the format after I've gotten 10 or so drafts in. So, thanks for watching, everybody. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to see my set review, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.